everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you a project that I thought was going to be quick and easy, but ended up being an absolute nightmare. This beautiful Edwardian floral blouse, based off of a 1903 shirtwaist pattern that was a bit of an Edwardian clickbait. But first, I'd like to take a second to thank the sponsor of the next portion of this video, MacLeod. As you may have noticed in a lot of my videos, my nails are often fairly fancy, and I'm not going to be doing a whole long spiel about it. Basically, I'm just going to show you what I'm going to do with my nails. So join me as we make this manicure real quick. Now, I am starting with the 7-in-1 Potion base coat and a simple nude color from another brand. Then I cover it with a nice layer of the smudge-free top coat, and I get started on stamping. Now I am using the M450 plate, which is a beautiful collection of laces, and I am doing 2 layers, one of which is this nice purple jelly polish and this golden champagne grayish whitish polish. So I am doing the purple layer first to kind of act as a shadow, and then I'm adding the golden shimmer on top, and it creates this really nice delicate look with a little bit of lace on my thumbs and on my ring fingers. If you would like to try this yourself, you can use my code KYLAB10, and that will give you 10% off your purchase, as well as helping to support my channel. Thank you so much, MacLeod, and let's get back to this disaster of a project. Now, like the last blouse video that I did, I'm going to have a day counter up here because this one is quite a complicated process, so I think we're just going to talk through it like a diary, telling you what I did that particular day. Also, I am wearing the blouse today. What do you think? Do you like the idea of me actually wearing the item in the intro, or is it kind of a spoiler? Let me know in the comments down below which one you think. So on day 1, I started bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in the dining room so that I would have a lot of space in order to draft the pattern. And first of all, I had to choose which pattern I wanted, either the one on 339 or the one on 342. They were both the simplest shirtwaists that I could find, and they were pretty similar, except the sleeve on the 342 one had a separate shoulder piece, or like the top of the sleeve, which I didn't really want. I wanted to keep it super simple. So I ended up doing 339, and also because I really liked the little point in the cuff. I think that was really cute. Part of the problem with this specific one is, well, with all of the shirtwaist options, the picture does not really give you a good idea of what this pattern on its own is going to look like, because they always make it extra fancy. In this one, they have like this whole thing on the shoulder, which is very cool, but it's not included in the instructions at all, and that makes it a little hard to understand what I'm looking at here. But I think this is the simplest shirtwaist there is that has the big poofy sleeves, which I'm wanting. So I think for the blouse, we're basically going to go exactly with this as is. So we need to pick one of these and get started. I'm thinking the standing collar looks like one of the smallest, so I'll start with that. So there were a few discrepancies between the pattern description and the instructions, and there definitely was not clear instructions on how to add the lace. Now on 339, this picture showed this really wide strip of lace going across the shoulders and across the front, and the instructions said absolutely nothing about this. So I decided that I was mostly going to stick to the instructions and the pattern, because again, I wanted to keep this pretty simple, since the chiffon that I decided to use is this really beautiful warm collection of abstract roses with a little bit of leaf in there. It's a very busy pattern, so I didn't want to do too much complicatedness with it. I wanted to keep the design itself super simple to show off the beautiful fabric. The collar was the first piece that I made, and I just followed the instructions, made it as is, and I went ahead and measured it. I just held it up to my own neck to see if this was actually going to be correct. Okay, so we're definitely going to have to make the collar bigger. I noticed that it seemed to be at least 2 inches too small, so I modified the pattern a little bit just to make sure that it would work. I also noticed that there were at least a couple of typos, it seemed, in the pattern pieces themselves, one of which was at the bottom of the front hem. Okay, so I have hit another snag because this doesn't make any sense here. So this is 14 1/4. Basically, this is going to be the grid. This one goes down by regular inches. This goes across by our special measurement. And you can see where the furthest point on this pattern is, and that is 14.4, which is right here. And then we have this. Somehow, that is 16 7/8. Now, my best guess is that they're somehow measuring like the hem here and saying we need to have this hem be 16 7/8 in total, but that doesn't really make much sense either. It could also be a mistake, and it could be 6 7/8. So let's see, where is that line? Second one up, 18 5/8. So where's the 6? 6 is there. So it could be 6. Okay, so I'm going to assume this means 6 7/8. We're gonna go from there. Because this is getting ridiculous. I did look through the rest of the book, and I found this same pattern piece again, which just had all of the same markings and everything, and it also had the typo of 16 7/8 instead of 6 7/8. So what I'm guessing is whatever the original pattern was that had been copied, that piece was just wrong. It's mentioned in the foreword to the book that the original patterns in the magazines didn't always include certain pieces that you would be expected to already know how to make, such as collars and cuffs, and occasionally sleeves. And I think that this particular shirtwaist was kind of just thrown together from a bunch of other pieces. I think that almost all of the other pieces appeared at least once elsewhere in the book. So I don't know whether that was the original situation where there was like only 1 or 2 pieces in this pattern, and they just, the original editors of the magazines pulled together a bunch of different pattern pieces and threw them together, or whether it was the editor of the book who had also said that she added in a couple of pattern pieces to fill in the blanks. So I'm not sure whether it was this way originally in the magazines or whether it was the editor of the book. Either way, this pattern had been copied and it had a mistake in it. Okay, well that's not fair. Right here, they have it coming in, but they don't tell me anything about how far in that is. There was also a problem with the back bodice piece. Down near the bottom, it kind of dips in a little bit. So here's the center, here's the neckline, shoulder, arm side, and then it comes in this way and then dips back out again. But the narrowest point down here at the bottom was not labeled in any way, so I don't know if that was just a mistake or whether they expected you to be able to guess based on the curve. I don't know, but I did a little bit of finagling and I guesstimated about what that length should be. So that was at least 2 typos or just like bits of needed information that were problematic with this particular pattern. I looked through some of my lace. I wondered if I should add any lace, but again, the floral pattern of the chiffon was so busy that I didn't really feel the need to add anything. But I did really like how black bias tape looked with it, so I was thinking I might use that in a few places. I looked through my buttons and really wasn't sure of which ones. At that point, I think I picked some metal buttons. And I was also wondering, were the cuffs supposed to close with buttons or something like that? I couldn't really tell, it didn't say. Also, the instructions said that it closed in the back, but they weren't clear how, whether it was, just one button at the neckline, or whether the entire thing was supposed to be buttoned down, or was it supposed to be hooks and eyes? I don't really know. It didn't say. Also, I wasn't sure whether or not I should leave it loose so that it would be easier to tuck in, or whether I should gather it at the bottom. What are we gathering to? What does the bottom of this garment look like? Gather excess fullness at the waist to fit the waist measurement. but it didn't say whether there was supposed to be a bit of bias tape down there or whether there was supposed to be some sort of waist section. It just didn't say. I was also a little bit worried about the length of the bodice. I measured my back and realized that the back of the shirt was way too short, so I lengthened it by 2 inches by just slashing and spreading, which is just one of the simplest ways of editing a pattern, which is you just cut along and add a strip of paper. So I added 2 strips of 1 inch each. I also tried to think about how I'd be able to keep the fabric from fraying, because I was really worried about that. Alright, so I didn't film much of that at all, but... Oh, careful, careful, careful!
This one. Hi guys! Mommy finished gathering the shoulders.
Yeah, so I gathered the shoulders and attached them to the back, and I pinned the side seams as well. I will say this fabric is really hard to use. It's very stretchy and does not want to sit still, so I decided that having pencil marks on it is probably not the worst thing in the world, especially since I'm not having to mark any darts or anything like that. Pretty much all of the pencil lines will be hidden by seams anyways, so I'm not too worried about that. I think it'll just be easier in the long run. Oddly, I feel like, I don't know why, but I expected the shoulders to be a lot more gathered than they are. Like, I don't think this is even 2 to 1. But you know, we'll see. The whole front neckline will also get gathered at some point.
I need to gather it.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think that's about it.
I wanted to put it on.
Yeah.
Mommy, can you let me put it on? No, put it right here.
Right there?
Yeah.
Oh, you want these two together? Like that?
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. The next day, I got some matching thread, which was surprisingly difficult. I didn't expect it to be quite this much of a hassle. I ended up getting this really nice peachy pinkish sort of color that, while it didn't necessarily match any specific colors, it went with the vibe, and I felt like it was dark enough to not be easily seen over the dark areas, but it also wasn't super light. It was just a nice mid-tone. I worked on putting the rest of the bodice together, starting with the underarm seams, and I think that was the point at which I decided I wanted to do at least a few of the seams using French seams, which are definitely difficult to figure out initially because you're kind of working backwards. I wanted to have this piece be a little bit more finished than other things that I had made and have really nice finished seams on the inside, so I didn't have to worry about fraying at all. I wondered a bit about the back hem. The instructions just say to hem the center back, and they're not clear as to what exactly that's supposed to mean. Instructions now. We've gathered the front shoulders, joined back to front at shoulders and underarm seams, and now we're at hem center back. Okay, so another part that makes me a little concerned is sizing. Is the back actually the right size? Which I could figure out pretty quick by just trying it on in a second. And then it says waist opens in back. I didn't feel like there was enough happening in the front. It felt a bit too tight. The image looks like it's supposed to be super loose and blousey and flowy, and this one just wasn't much at all. I tried it on, very little to be gathered at the front. It's way less puffy than I thought it would be, but let's think about the front as well. It's belly button, so it is kind of a shorter shirt, but that's the waist there, so I think we'll be okay. We'll just have a very small hem at the bottom. Cool. Alright. And I ended up putting it on my dress form. Arms were set quite far back, and the whole thing just felt way too tight. Oh.
Like this.
Yeah. Why do you love the dress form so much?
Because I love it, but you did.
So there's a few options here. We could assume that this is accurate and
It's accurate.
panic.
Is it accurate?
We could assume that it's
Like
inaccurate
it's accurate
and
sure?
panic.
and panic.
Yeah.
Just like the picture. Right there.
The next day I tried adding an inch wide bias tape to the back hem, but I didn't really like it because it felt really stiff, which, I mean, I did want it to be stronger, but it just felt a bit too noticeable. I cut out the sleeve pattern, I pinned out and cut the sleeves, and then I tried to start working on the cuffs. I decided that I wanted to be cut on the fold, and then I cut out the collar as well. The next day I gathered the sleeve. I thought about maybe putting this nice pink ribbon on the bottom to cover the waist. And I was thinking about using burgundy buttons for this piece. I still wasn't perfectly happy with them, but the burgundy seemed to look really nice with the pink ribbon and the fabric. I checked on the armhole size, which definitely still seemed a bit too small, and I tried it on and I had a lot of disappointment. I am beginning to think I should recut the bodice. Now, the armholes are definitely on the small side. The entire thing is very short. I'm not sure you can really see. I mean, this is a crop top. Like, it technically fits, but there is like almost nothing to gather here. I feel like I should recut the bodice. I think the sleeves are probably fine, the cuffs are probably fine. Another part of why I'm worried about this is because the chemise ended up feeling a little small on the top. And I feel like this is going to do the same thing. I mean, obviously this isn't cut in, the armhole is actually like here, not here. But even still, I feel like it's still going to feel too tight. This just doesn't feel like it's supposed to fit like this. This is a crop top, which, I mean, it's cute, but I think it's supposed to be poofier than this. I'm gonna double check my math on the proportional figure, and then we'll cut out new bodices, because I don't think I can save this. It was definitely too small. It was not even close to being the kind of blouse that you were looking at in the picture, and just, it didn't feel right. So I went through some thought experiments about Edwardian proportions, which in this case was basically 10 inches difference between the bust and the waist. I was also really worried about the length of it. It still seemed way too short even after adding 2 inches to the back and quite a bit extra on the front seam as well. It just did not feel like I was long enough. I experimented a bit with some pins and my own shirt to see how much extra fabric I would want to have for tucking in. I tried on my 1860s corset and my 1950s corset, basically to see what my minimum waist would be in any particular case, because that was definitely the absolute minimum of what we could expect. So I think I managed to, after a lot of work, I managed to lace down to 26, which would be the absolute minimum that I could make this be. And so if 26 was my waist measurement, you could add 10 to that and you would have at least a 36-inch bust, which was already 1 inch bigger than I had done with the 35 scale. So I decided to go with 27 for my waist because that wasn't the absolute minimum and it was still pretty comfortable, and go with that moving forward, because that would mean I could use a 37 bust, which was a lot better than going all the way up to a 40, for example. My natural waist could be naturally as relaxed as about 30 inches, and I really didn't want to go all the way up to a 40 because that would be 5 extra inches in the bust that I just would not be able to make work. So I decided to go for a happy medium of 37 for the bust, because that's not too much more and it's also not that small for my waist. Now I was still going to gather the waist down to a more relaxed waist measurement to, I think I ended up being 28 or 29, but this would help the general proportions work better for me. There's something really weird about this pattern, and that is that it's not long enough. In the front of the book, it says that the proportional figure is supposed to have a waist length of 16, which means from the big joint in the back to the waist was expected to be 16 inches, which is fine. We can work with that. I like a number. Numbers are good. But the problem is that the patterns for these blouses don't match that length. Because I would expect the skirt to end at the waist, right? So you would want to have at least enough to cover like the first inch of your waist, right? You want to have it at least this long, but it's not. It's like an inch or two too short. So what I did was I worked through some of the ratios, because all of the scales back here that we've been using for the width, we could technically use for the length as well. So I noticed that on the previous back pattern I had added 2 inches, and that made me pretty happy with how this was working. The weird thing was that I had also added 2 inches, but it was like to the side here and not to any of the rest of it. And I didn't stretch it, I just added like 2 straight bars of 1 inch down here. Now, part of my problem has been consistently that, for one thing, the shoulders feel a little tight. The armholes have always been small. Now, they're supposed to be small. Historically, armholes were small because they technically gave you better range of motion. When you're not wearing a stretchy fabric, you want to have your armhole fairly small, kind of like this one, so that you can raise your arm up and not rip anything. So small armholes are good, however they should be comfortable and shouldn't be cutting off any circulation. So the armholes as they are just barely tolerable. So I would not mind at all if they were a little bit bigger. So I decided that I was just going to draft the bodice pieces again using the 32 scale instead of the 1:1. Now, I had already counted through the 30 scale here that you're supposed to use if you have a 30-inch bust. This is exactly an inch, so you can use this instead of a regular ruler if you want to. So I just scaled it up to the 32 instead of the 30, and that gave me obviously a slightly longer piece on both of these. This gives us like an extra 1.25 inches or so on the length. And it did lengthen the armholes just a tiny bit, but we only really need a tiny bit. It added quite a bit more to the shoulder, but that's okay. I'm happy with that, especially since the shoulder's going to get gathered up anyways, and I don't mind having my sleeves be a slightly drop shoulder if that ends up being that way. It's just giving a little bit more, gives us about 1 inch sideways. Of course, that's not from the vertical, that's just from the sideways. But the vertical gives you more room all the way along here. So I'm pretty happy with these patterns as they are. Then I started constructing the second bodice. This time I cut it out with the edge of the back piece being on the selvage, which is a finished edge. I wanted to do this just so I would only have to turn it through once without having to worry about the inside being felt or anything like that. I also did French seams everywhere. I don't remember whether or not I did that on the first bodice, but this time I definitely did French seams everywhere I could manage. So the shoulders, under the arms, and I planned on doing it for basically everywhere else as well. This bodice fit a lot more loosely, the length was a smidge better, but again, if I was doing this again, I would definitely size up a little bit more. I found that a large portion of my process is just sitting there and staring at a thing for a good long time before I figure out what it is exactly that I'm going to do next. Part of what I was trying to figure out was how I was going to attach the collar. What I ended up doing was adding the piping to the outside layer of the collar, and then gathering the bodice into that, and then attaching the inside layer of the collar, and then I used bias tape all around the edge of the collar and down the back to cover up the raw edges so I wouldn't have to worry about that at all. And I had a pretty bad migraine that day, so I took a little bit of a break. I watched Bernadette Banner. She made a video remaking the Mary Poppins costume in a more Edwardian style, and she has an entire video on making a Edwardian shirtwaist, very similar to what I was doing. One thing that I had not thought of at all was she actually had no closures on the cuffs. I totally expected to have to use buttons because it was going to be a tight cuff, and I couldn't quite picture how I would get my hand into it, but amazingly it works just fine. I don't actually have to have a closure because it's not skin tight, it is snug, but not so snug that I couldn't pull my hand out again. So I thought that was a grand idea because I did not want to have to do a gazillion buttonholes, and if I could get rid of a few, that'd be great. I used piping and bias tape for the edges. I was starting to feel like it just was not going to work very well. The point wouldn't sit flat no matter what I did, and I was starting to have a really bad feeling about it. The next working day, I attached the cuffs to the sleeves, which was basically I had to gather the sleeve, pin it into place, and baste it in my hand. And then I tried the sleeve on. And I think this face pretty much tells you everything you need to know. I was a bit disappointed. The pointed cuff just did not want to sit nicely at all. The sleeve was just overall too tight. It was a fine sleeve for something, but it had no poof, no extra give. So I also recognized that it was probably a little bit too short. I don't know why I didn't think about that later. Foreshadowing. But I did not like the sleeve, didn't know what to do about it, and I went to bed angry. Because yet again, I had to make a new thing. The next day, I looked through the book for new sleeves. And I just went through, and for every pattern that had a somewhat similar poofy style sleeve with cuffs, I would go through the pattern, I would look for something that was roughly the same shape, just bigger, and I was a little confused. I ended up doing some math to basically convert my bicep size into the book's units. So again, the 30 scale is kind of the default, and at this point I was using 37. So when I measured my arm, ended up being 11 inches. That was what it was in the 37 scale. So I took that and moved it over into the 30 scale, ended up being 9 units, which was a nice round number. So if I wanted to have 2 to 3 times my bicep circumference for a sleeve, and since I wanted it to be really poofy, basically in the narrowest part of the sleeve, I wanted that to be at least twice my bicep size. So I was looking for 18 units. So I'm still in the middle of doing the time lapse here, but I just wanted to show you something real quick. And that is this pattern I just happened to see. It's got these nice little sleeves that kind of look similar to what we've got here. Just a teeny bit of looseness around, maybe a little skinny, but it's relatively similar, right? So if we look over here, go through the pattern, okay, here we go. Narrowest point, 12. And over here we could see the fancy sleeve, the big, gigantic, poofy sleeve. The narrowest width is 12.375. And over here, it's 12 minus 1.5, so that's what, 10.5 inches here. So the big poofy sleeve is like 2 inches bigger than this sleeve right here. So clearly the picture is kind of clickbaity because you're not, under any circumstance, going to get something like this by adding 2 inches to this. Look at how huge this is. This is bigger than her head. Like, obviously, you know, they seemed to like having small heads on their drawings and everything, but still, this, her arm is like here, right? It's half that. How is this supposed to come from that? I don't get it. So I went through the book, looked at every poofy sleeve I could find, and I looked at the narrowest section. and there were not very many options that were actually 2 times my bicep circumference. Almost nothing was 18 units wide. I did find, I think, 2 or 3 patterns that did sort of work. I ended up finding this pattern, which appeared twice in the book, one with this and one with that, and I decided, okay, this one was one of the biggest that I could do. I don't think it was the biggest one had a yoke sort of thing, but this was a fairly simple looking sleeve pattern, and it looked like it was at least close to big enough. So I decided I would draft this new sleeve pattern. I ended up passing out in the middle of drafting it, which was interesting. I ended up cutting out the new sleeves, which were much bigger. I was very happy about this. And the next day I French seamed the long seam in the sleeve, and I added the cuff, and I was really excited about it because it looked nice and poofy. We were on the right track, and then I realized that the cuffs were just a little bit too tight. I think I had just done a little bit more seam allowance than it had expected me to, and so I had to unpick it and put it back on. But since I was making it wider, I had to also unpick all the gathers as well. Thankfully, I had only mostly basted them in, so I had to do the cuffs again. Thankfully, I didn't have to make brand new ones. There was enough seam allowance left that I could just make the seam allowance a little smaller, and it ended up working, thankfully. The next day. This was the day when I ranted a lot in time-lapse because I forgot to change it out of time-lapse mode. Why do I do this to myself? So basically the underarm sleeve was way too short. I tried it on and it just did not make any sense at all. So I pulled out the pattern and I realized that this pattern, which I had initially thought, hey, this blousey sleeve looks great. It even has a nice tight cuff at the wrist, but this cuff is a lot longer. I'd say this was probably about 6 inches wide for this cuff, and it looks a lot tighter than mine. So it was expecting to have a much larger cuff. So clearly I had made these sleeves be a bit too short, which made me very upset. Okay, so since I somehow managed to do all of the chit-chat that I had last night with the time-lapse on instead of the actual video, I'm going to try to briefly recount what happened. What I realized last night after having finished both cuffs is that the underarm seam right here is way too short. I can put my arm in here and this underarm seam is just, there's no way that this could possibly match up to my arm side unless I just always have my arm like this, which is very uncomfortable. So unless I don't want to be able to raise my arm at all, I need to figure out how to give myself a bit more fabric up here. And this is because the shape of this sleeve, this is just half of it, it's folded at the moment, is a lot longer in the middle than it is on the side. And for some reason, I didn't think about that at all. I mean, you can see how much shorter this side is than this centerpiece. So when I looked at the length and I saw, oh, this is plenty long. So it's, I think this is 23 inches long here, and that's a couple of inches longer than I needed it to be because it's nice and poofy and everything. But for some reason, I did not think about checking the side arm seam. And part of the reason why this is a big problem is because for some reason in a lot of these puffy sleeve patterns, the bottom has this very dramatic curve just like the top does. But if you look in more modern patterns, usually the sleeve will have, you know, the arm side shape, but then it'll be straight across the bottom. So this is just very complicated. If you look at, you know, the picture here, you can see how it looks like it's a lot more gathered on one side than the other, but they don't tell you how to make that happen. And I think it looks a little bit awkward, so I just gathered it all together. But that means that this just doesn't fit. So last night I was trying to figure out how I could put in some sort of gusset, which would be triangular or diamond shaped piece in the armpit area to give that extra fabric. And there were two main ways I could do this. One would be to basically attach it to the sleeve and make up for that missing fabric that you can see here. And the other way would be to attach it to the bodice and potentially have part of the sleeve gathered down into it. And I really didn't like either of these options because of just how much fabric we're missing. I'm not needing to just add a little bit of ease. I am needing to add like 6 inches or more. Yeah, this is just not working. This gusset section would have to be quite dramatic. I couldn't have it just be a nice little triangle like you'd expect for a normal gusset. It would have to be very long and quite narrow. And I just couldn't picture how this would work. But after looking at this for a little bit longer, I had this idea that maybe we could use some lace in this sort of formation here to basically allow me to cut off the end of this and extend it a bit, or just switch out the shoulder area for an entirely new thing. So my original thinking was that it was going to have to be a 6-inch wide lace, partially because this is a very wide lace here, but you know, I'm trying to add something to make up for the missing fabric. But I don't necessarily need to do that. I just need something to allow for a seam in this sleeve. Because if I were to do a seam right now, it would be very obvious where it was. I mean, it's not too bad with a French seam, but you'd notice it and it changes the way that it drapes. So I was going through all of my lace last night and I don't have many black lace options. I do have one more that's back in storage because I was going to use it for a different project. I do have this. It's a very cheap lace. And it's fine. So I guess the question now is, what should the new shoulder of this look like? So I'm going to have to do some geometric braining because what I need to do is design a new part of this that's somehow making up for this. And that's quite a task because I can't quite wrap my brain around that. And we're going to need to pull out the cutting board and paper and pencil again and see if we could figure out how to make this work. So I've got my working hard vest and my lipstick on. Let's get this thing done. I played around with the sleeve pattern to better understand the missing pieces and how much fabric to add. I didn't end up actually using this purple paper for anything, but it really helped me to figure out how the curved bottom of this sleeve was making the underarm seam a lot shorter than I expected. I wondered where the lace should be, about how far up the sleeve it should be, and I used my blocking pins and pads to slice off the shoulder section of my sleeve. Basically, I pinned the cuff carefully into place, and then I pulled the rest of the sleeve fabric along as gently as I could and laid it all nicely with all the gathers and everything, so I could find where I wanted that lace and just slice it right there. I used the piece of the shoulder sleeve that I cut off to kind of give me some idea of how much extra we should add for a new shoulder and about how much lace I would need. And somehow I didn't quite calculate this length correctly. It ended up being just slightly gathered up here, which is fine, whatever. The next day, I picked this nice wider lace. I really like that it has straight edges in it, so it's a little bit geometric, but it also has flowers in it to kind of fit the floral aesthetic. And it's net lace, so it actually has a little bit of extra drape that fits the chiffon much better. I added lace to the shoulder section because I knew that was the side where the lace would fit nicely and we could gather in the sleeve material if we needed to. I added the shoulder section to the sleeve. It wasn't a perfect fit, obviously, but it works. It kind of changed the drape of the sleeves a little bit, but not so much that it bothers me, and I think it's a really nice added detail. I'm fine with it. So I tried on the blouse and I realized that it was a bit tight across the shoulders, across my shoulder blades whenever I moved my arms forward. So I had to figure out what I was going to do to help fix this. I did not want to add any fabric to the back in any way because I had the bias tape there. I didn't want to add like some triangular thing because it would just be adding extra seams, and I didn't want that at all. And I figured there might be a better way of fixing this. So what I ended up doing was actually taking quite a bit out of the armholes in the front piece and a little bit on the bottom in order to help it fit correctly, because tight armholes were very common in this time period. It actually helps you have a little bit better range of motion than if you had a lot of fabric going this way. But the armholes on this were still a bit too tight. And even in the chemise that I made a few months ago from the same book, the armholes were definitely a bit tighter than I'd like. And finally, I hit the point where I was like, okay, this feels a lot better. It's way more comfortable. It's not pulling as much across the back. After that, I did a little bit of fixing up on the bias tape on the back of the collar because it was kind of poking up a little. So the next day, I decided that the armholes were finally where I wanted them. I got a little bit distracted with kitty snuggles, but that is a common occurrence. I basted in the piping to check the fitting, and then I tried to figure out how to add the sleeves with a nice finished edge. As I had said before, so far, pretty much everything had a nice finished edge. Either the edge was caught between two layers of fabric, like on the collar and cuffs, or it was French seamed, like in the underarm and on the shoulders. But I didn't know if it was even possible to do something like that with the sleeve. I was trying to picture, okay, could I use bias tape to cover the raw edges on the inside? That's a whole nother seam. That's a lot more layers of fabric, and I really didn't want that. But I did somehow manage to figure out how to do French seams from sleeves. That's like two very complicated things. You toss them together and somehow it worked. I am very happy about how the seams ended up working on these sleeves. So day 15, I tried it on with a pencil skirt because that was one of the ways that I planned on wearing this for the reveal. And I was really worried about the length. Okay, so before I sign off on the waistband for this, I wanted to try it on with a pencil skirt because that's one of the main ways I plan on wearing this. So this is a high-waisted pencil skirt, and obviously the front is fine, it's pretty long, but the back definitely seems to be too short. So I don't want to give up on this book. I like this book. I like what it stands for. I like that it offers a bunch of patterns from my favorite time period. But this particular pattern, I'm a little over, if you know what I mean. I messed around a bit and made a little pattern piece to add to the back, to add about 2 or 3 inches of extra space just so that I would be able to have a slightly longer line. That's why I said earlier I wish I had done even more vertical stretching than just the 32. I think I easily could have done 34, 35, maybe even a little more, just because I still was not happy with the armhole and I still wasn't happy with the length. Next day, I added 2 layers of the wide bias tape to the bottom to give it a nice finished look. I was originally just going to do 1 layer of this 1-inch bias tape, but it felt a little bit short and I wanted to give myself just a smidge more room to be able to tuck this in, and because I really thought it looked cute to actually unfold the bias tape, so it was about 2 inches wide, and that was really cute and I really liked how that looked. So I ended up doing that. And I added buttons and buttonholes, and that was it. I mean, this was a really frustrating project because I hit so many roadblocks. Like I said, I think I made every part of this twice, which is not what you want to have to do, especially when you're working with a really nice fabric. So that's about it. Let's take a look at the final overly cinematic montage.